I was 5 feet and 3 inches tall, and I weighed 122 pounds on the morning. The Threnval filed their formal complaint about my assignment to the Lethais Corridor Joint Command. I know the exact numbers because Admiral Chen asked me to confirm them before she sent the response. She sat across from me in her office aboard the Meridian station with her hands flat on her desk and a particular expression on her face. Not amusement, exactly, but the kind of careful neutrality that people wear when they are trying very hard not to let amusement show. "They've noted," she said, "that the physical specifications of the assigned human liaison fall significantly below the expected threshold for officers of command-adjacent rank." "I'm aware they've noted that," I said. "They've used the word negligible in an official diplomatic communication." I read the filing, Admiral. She looked at me for a moment. "They've also noted that your academic designation is in gravitational survey methodology, which they describe as a secondary discipline that is, quote, adequately represented in the existing Threnval operational team." "It's adequately represented in their primary data collection," I said. "Their resonance mapping is excellent. The secondary analysis work is a different question." "They don't seem to think secondary analysis is at issue." "No," I said, "they don't." She looked at me again. Then she picked up her stylus and signed the confirmation. "You're still going," she said. "Try not to embarrass them too badly." I told her I would do my best. That was technically true. The Threnval are not a species that maps cleanly onto anything a human brain is built to process at first encounter. The closest I can come, for someone who hasn't seen one, is to describe a column of water that has learned to have opinions. They are translucent, not glass clear, but the blue-gray opacity of deep ocean water in low light, and they shift. Not dramatically, not like something out of a performance or a fever dream. But the surface of a Threnval officer in a professional setting moves the way a river moves. A continuous, low-level current of form adjustment, the outermost layer flowing in slow eddies while the inner structure holds its general shape. They are tall. The shortest Threnval officer aboard the Fleet Prime vessel, Lethais Von, stood at something just under 3 meters, and that was the aide who handed me my arrival documentation without looking at me. They communicate through resonant frequency modulations. Their translators rendered it as sound in roughly the range of a low baritone, with overtones that the translation unit smoothed out but that you could still hear underneath if you paid attention, like hearing the original instrument through a cover version. Their word for a solid-bodied being, any solid-bodied being, translated into what my unit gave me as compressed. It wasn't derogatory, technically. It was taxonomic. But taxonomy has a way of carrying feeling in it, and the way a Threnval said compressed, when referring to a human, was the same way a person might say quaint. I had read their full diplomatic and military dossier before boarding my transit shuttle. I had also read 3 secondary analyses, 2 independent academic treatments of Threnval command culture, and a set of informal notes passed between the 3 human observers who had been attached to Threnval operations in the preceding 4 years. The informal notes were the most useful. They had the texture of field experience, the kind of practical information that gets edited out of official reports because it can't be sourced or confirmed, but that turns out to be exactly right. The notes said, "They do not mock openly. They find open mockery inefficient. What they do instead is quantify. They will measure you, file the measurement, and then proceed to operate around you as though your measurements constitute your total operational value. The mockery is in the arithmetic. If you let them define the numbers, they have already concluded the argument before it begins." I boarded the Lethais Von at 0700 on the 14th of March, carrying a standard-issue liaison kit, a change of clothes, and a data tablet I had loaded with 462 pages of annotated Lethais corridor navigational and tactical survey data that I had spent the previous 6 weeks acquiring, cross-referencing, and condensing into a working assessment that nobody had asked me to produce. Nobody had asked me to produce it because nobody had expected it to be necessary. The Joint Command structure was a diplomatic arrangement, not an operational one. My role, as it had been explained to me, was to be present to observe, to facilitate communication if communication was needed, and to represent the human contingent in a context where the human contingent was, as the briefing officer had put it, a courtesy seat at a table that the Threnval have already set. I had nodded at that. Then I had gone and built my 462 pages anyway. The first 3 days aboard the HFY were primarily administrative. I was issued a personal resonance identifier, a small device worn on the outer uniform that translated my physical presence into a signal the ship's environmental systems could register, since the ship had not been designed with solid-bodied crew in mind, and there were several compartments whose environmental management would have been confused by an unidentified dense-mass object moving through them. The aide who issued the device explained this to me with complete operational neutrality. I wore the device, it worked, I was not confused with cargo. I also spent the first 3 days learning the ship's spatial logic. The HFY was a large vessel, and it had been built for the Threnval, which meant that the design principles it operated on were entirely sensible and also entirely unlike anything I had navigated before. Corridor heights were 3.5 meters at minimum, because the Threnval are tall and they prefer operational clearance. The control interfaces were designed for beings who could extend a portion of their outer surface into a display field, rather than pressing buttons or entering inputs manually. The mess, the Threnval equivalent of a meal facility, though meal is an imprecise translation for a species that absorbs nutrients through a different mechanism, was a large, light-filled chamber that I was entirely welcome to use, and that had been fitted with one small table and one small chair and one small nutrition dispenser operating on human-compatible rations, which was either a courtesy or an acknowledgement that I was going to be aboard for a month and would need to eat. I ate my meals at the small table and worked on my data tablet and watched the Threnval move through the chamber in their operational configurations and thought about the informal observer notes, which said, among other things, that the first week aboard a Threnval vessel had a way of either breaking a human sense of professional proportion or clarifying it. I was not sure which one I was experiencing. By day 3, I thought it might be clarification. Fleet Commander Veth Naron was the senior Threnval officer aboard the HFY and the commanding authority for the Joint Corridor Survey operation. She was, by Threnval standards, old. Her outer layer carried a slightly deeper opacity than the younger officers, a denser blue-gray that their culture apparently associated with accumulated experience, though my reading suggested it was as much a biological marker as a social one. She received me in the ship's primary reception chamber, which was a large, bright space with no chairs. Threnval do not use chairs, and a floor that was polished to a reflective finish that made you acutely aware, standing on it, of exactly how much of yourself there was. She looked at me for a long time. Threnval have no eyes in the way humans do. The sensory structures are distributed across the leading surface of their form, which means that when a Threnval is attending to something, their entire forward face turns toward it with an attentiveness that is, in my experience, somewhat more thorough than a human stare. Veth Naron attended to me with the comprehensive focus of someone reading a document that has been filed in the wrong category. "Liaison Officer Solis," she said, through the translator, with the overtone underneath that I had already learned to read as studied neutrality. "Your transit documentation has been processed." "Thank you, Fleet Commander." "Your physical profile has been logged in the crew manifest." "I understand." A brief pause. The outer surface of her form moved in a slow current. "The manifest classification system does not have a category for your specification range. We have placed you in the auxiliary inventory column as a placeholder. This will be corrected in the next manifest revision. I considered that for a moment. Auxiliary inventory. I had been filed alongside the spare parts. That's quite all right, I said. I don't expect to need a category. She attended to me for one more beat, the way you might look at a sentence that doesn't quite parse. Then she gestured to an aide, one of the thin ones, nearly 4 meters, with the lighter translucency of a junior officer, and told him to show me to my quarters. The quarters were, predictably, sized for a Threnval. My bunk was a recessed shelf set into the wall that I had to climb a stepladder to reach. I slept well. I have always been a good sleeper. The first briefing was 4 days after my arrival, and it ran for 6 hours. I will not describe all 6 hours. The operational overview of the Lethais Corridor Joint Survey was technically complex, and the Threnval deliver their briefings with a thoroughness that assumes all participants have processed all background documentation and are prepared to discuss any subsection in immediate depth, which, in fairness, I was. But the other human observers I had been told to expect, 2 officers from the joint diplomatic mission who were slated to arrive a week after me, had been delayed, and so, for the first briefing, I was the sole human in a room with 11 Threnval officers, ranging in rank from the fleet commander down to 2 junior analysts who had been assigned to manage the survey data. The room was a large, hexagonal space with a holographic display unit at its center, a column of projected light that the Threnval interacted with by extending portions of their outer surface into it, adjusting the display with what looked to an outside observer like the column of water, simply reaching into the light and rearranging it. I sat in the one chair that had been placed in the room, which was either a courtesy or a way of marking my location as distinct from the operational participants, and I watched and I listened. I also took notes, 51 pages of them by the end of the 6 hours, on the data tablet I had brought from the Meridian. What I was looking for, and what I found by the 3rd hour, was a gap in their survey methodology. Not a flaw, exactly. The Threnval are rigorous, and their survey instruments are tuned for their own sensory architecture, which processes the corridor's spatial data through resonance mapping that is, in most respects, more sensitive than anything the human contingent would have brought to the same job. But resonance mapping has a particular relationship with solid mass interference. In a corridor like the Lethais, which runs through a section of space with several remnant planetary bodies in various states of orbital decay, the resonance returns from the solid debris fields have a characteristic echo signature that can mask secondary gravitational signals if the analysis algorithm isn't calibrated for it. The Threnval calibration was excellent. It was calibrated for Threnval standard debris fields, which are composed primarily of silicate and metallic compounds. The Lethais remnant bodies were partially carbonaceous. The echo signature was slightly different. Not wrong, not enough to flag as an error in the system, but enough, if you knew what you were looking at, to produce a systematic underread of the corridor's secondary gravitational topology in the mid-sector. I had known what I was looking at. I had found the same pattern in the survey data I had pulled from the Meridian archives 6 weeks earlier, back when nobody had asked me to look at it. I had spent 4 days confirming it. I had 3 independent cross-references. I made a note on page 37 of my briefing notes and underlined it. Then I kept listening. There was a sub-commander, Vethorvan, second in rank aboard the Lethais Von, who had made up his mind about me in the first 2 minutes of the first briefing and had not revised that opinion in the 4 days since my arrival. He was, by the standards of my reading of the informal observer notes, a textbook example of the quantification approach. He didn't ignore me. That would have been a form of engagement. What he did was more precise. He included me in the room's operational frame exactly as much as was required by protocol, which was not much, and excluded me from it in every way that was not required. When he addressed a point to the room and my data tablet chimed, I had muted it immediately after the first chime, but not fast enough. He didn't look at me. He looked at the space adjacent to me, which was a more efficient form of dismissal than looking away. He was not hostile. That is important to say clearly. Threnval command culture does not accommodate what I would call personal hostility. It's too imprecise, too variable, and the command environment they operate in has zero tolerance for variable performance. What Vethorvan had done was arrive at a professional conclusion. The human liaison was an appendage of the diplomatic arrangement, had no operational relevance, and would be managed accordingly. It was a reasonable conclusion. It was also incorrect, but I saw no reason to make that point before the point made itself. I had 2 brief interactions with Vethorvan in the days between the first and second briefing that were worth noting, in the sense that I noted them internally, though I did not log them anywhere. The first was in the corridor outside the data center. I was coming out, he was going in. The corridor was wide enough for 2 Threnval to pass comfortably. For me and a Threnval, it was wide enough for me to step aside and press myself against the wall, which I did, and which he acknowledged with a brief formal resonance tone, the equivalent of a nod, nothing more as he passed. His outer surface moved past at a height that meant his lower peripheral sensing structures were approximately level with my eye line. I do not think he was aware of this. I also do not think it would have changed anything if he had been. The second interaction was at the operational display unit in the chart room, where I had taken to doing 2 hours of work each evening after the Threnval senior officers had finished their end-of-day review. The chart room was quiet then, occupied by 1 or 2 junior analysts running routine data checks, and the display unit was available. I was working through my carbonaceous fraction cross-reference for the 3rd time when Vethorvan came in to pull a specific data set from the archive. He noticed me at the display unit, which surprised him. I could tell because there was a brief, fractional adjustment to the angle of his outer surface that I had come to read as the Threnval equivalent of a pause to recalibrate. He pulled his data set without comment. I kept working. He left. It was not a conversation, but it was, I think, the first time he had seen me doing operational work rather than sitting in a chair, and I filed it away as a data point. The second briefing happened on day 7. This one was smaller: Vethnaron, Vethorvan, 3 senior analysts, and me. The topic was the mid-sector survey phasing, which is to say the topic was exactly the section of the corridor where I had found the calibration gap. The lead analyst, a precise, deliberate officer named Vethsaron, who had, across the previous 4 days, been the only Threnval aboard the Lethaisvan to ask me a direct question about my background. She had wanted to know my primary training discipline, which I had told her was gravitational survey methodology, a fact she had recorded and apparently filed without further comment, was presenting the phasing schedule. It was a good schedule. It was the right approach for the survey type, efficiently sequenced, well supported. It was also, in its current form, going to produce a systematic underread of the mid-sector secondary gravitational topology, for exactly the reasons I had identified on page 37 of my briefing notes, and had confirmed 3 times since. I sat in my chair, the same chair, which had been placed in the same position in the room, which I had come to think of as a permanently useful indicator of where in the room I was expected to be, and I watched Vethsaron finish her presentation and open the floor to review. 3 analysts commented. Vethorvan approved the schedule with a formal notation. Vethnaron authorized it with a second notation. Then there was a pause, which was the point at which the briefing would formally close. "Fleet Commander," I said. Vethnaron attended to me. Around the table, which was a raised platform surface that the Threnval arranged themselves around without sitting, their forms maintaining their operational configuration through the hours of the briefing, with the easy continuity of beings whose physiology doesn't accumulate the kind of postural fatigue that gives humans lower back trouble. The other officers also attended to me. Not quite the same way. Vethorvan attended to me the way you attend to something you have correctly predicted will need to be managed. I have a note on the mid-sector phasing, I said. Specifically the calibration parameters for debris field resonance returns in survey blocks 14 through 22. A brief silence, not hostile, taxonomic. Vethoran spoke first. She was precise. She was also fair, in the way that someone trained to be rigorous is fair. She didn't dismiss, she evaluated. The calibration parameters are set to the standard Threnval debris field model, she said. They have been validated against 17 prior corridor surveys. I understand. The prior corridors were predominantly silicate and metallic in their remnant composition. A very brief pause. That is standard for this survey region. The Lethai's mid-sector remnants have a carbonaceous fraction of approximately 31% in blocks 14 through 22. That's above the threshold where the standard model's echo signature algorithm begins to produce a systematic secondary gravity under read. Another pause, longer. Vethsoran's outer surface moved in the particular way I had come to associate, in my week of observation, with active processing, not distress, not dismissal, but the physiological equivalent of looking something up. The carbonaceous fraction data, she said carefully, is not in the standard survey archive. No, I said. It's in the remnant body compositional analysis from the independent survey run by the Meridian Geological Team 14 years ago. It wasn't classified, but it wasn't cross-indexed to the corridor survey files. I found it in the secondary archive. I set my data tablet on the platform surface and slid it across carefully to the nearest point where Vethsoran's outer surface could interact with it. Pages 214 through 219. The cross-reference to the calibration impact is on pages 388 through 391. I have 3 independent confirmations. The room was quiet, not the silence of dismissal, something different. Vethsoran reached for my tablet with a careful extension of her outer layer and pulled the data into the room's display unit. The holographic column reorganized. She worked through it with a methodical speed that confirmed, if I had needed confirmation, that she was very good at her job. Vethorvan said nothing. He attended to the display unit. 4 minutes passed. They were quiet minutes. Somewhere outside the briefing room, the ship was doing the quiet mechanical business of being a ship in transit. Pressure adjustments, corridor ventilation, the low harmonic of the drive system that I had stopped consciously hearing by the 3rd day. The carbonaceous fraction analysis is valid, Vethsoran said. It was not a concession. It was a finding. The calibration impact at 31% is consistent with the model's documented parameters. A pause. The mid-sector phasing schedule will require revision. Vethnaran said nothing for a moment. Then she made a notation in the operational record. I heard the specific frequency modulation that my translator had taught me was the equivalent of an official log entry, and she attended to me again. "How long have you had this finding?" she asked. 6 weeks, I said. I identified the preliminary pattern before my departure from the Meridian. I confirmed it during the transit and finalized the cross-references in the 4 days before the first briefing. Another pause. You did not raise it in the first briefing. No, Fleet Commander. Why not? I considered the question. It was a fair question, asked in a tone that was equally fair, not accusatory, not flustered. Vethnaran was a professional, and professionals ask the operational question, which is, what was the decision logic? The first briefing was the operational overview, I said. The phasing schedule was listed for review in the second briefing. It seemed appropriate to raise a finding about the phasing in the phasing review. A long pause. The outer surface of Vethnaran's form moved in its continuous slow current. That is, she said, procedurally correct. I try to be useful in the right sequence, I said. I did not say anything else. I didn't need to. The mid-sector phasing revision took 3 days to complete. Veth Sauron ran the recalibration personally, with 2 of her analysts. I was available for questions throughout the process and answered 4 of them, all from Veth Sauron, all specific and technical, and asked in the flat, direct manner of someone who wanted accurate information and had decided that I was likely to provide it. None of the questions were asked by Veth Orvan. What Veth Orvan did in those 3 days was work. He ran the operational review of the revised phasing schedule with the same precise efficiency he brought to everything else. He flagged 2 points of integration detail that Veth Sauron corrected in her second pass. He signed off on the recalibration authorization with a formal notation that referenced the carbonaceous fraction data by source and my name by rank. He did not look at me while he did any of this. He also did not do the adjacent space thing, the precise exclusion. What he did instead was simply proceed, the way that a professional proceeds when a data variable has been updated and the calculation needs to run again with the new input. I did not track Veth Orvan's attendance to me during this period in any precise way. It is possible I was mistaken, but my general impression, and I was careful about my general impressions, because I had been warned in the informal notes that pattern reading Threnval's social dynamics from a human perceptual frame was unreliable, and I tried to account for that, was that the way he attended to me had changed. Not dramatically. The adjustment was small. He still positioned himself at the formal operational distance that protocol required. He still addressed me in the precise, uninflected way that Threnval command culture uses for addressing protocol-adjacent personnel. But the attending itself, the way the forward surface of his form oriented when I was speaking, was different from what it had been. It was the difference between attending to a filed document and attending to an active data source. I noted it and moved on. I had other things to do. Third briefing happened on day 12. The corridor survey had resumed with the revised phasing parameters, and the mid-sector data was coming in cleaner. The secondary gravitational topology was resolving with significantly better fidelity than the original schedule would have produced, and Veth Sauron had noted, in a formal operational annotation, that the recalibration had improved data quality in the affected blocks by a factor of roughly 2.3. This was logged in the operational record. I was listed in the annotation as the source of the original finding. The listing used my rank and name, which was the first time I had appeared in the formal operational record of the Lethais by anything other than the placeholder in the auxiliary inventory column. In the days between the second and third briefings, I had noticed a change in the way the junior analysts treated the data terminal I used in the chart room. Previously, they had worked around me with the polite opacity that characterized most of my interactions with the ship's crew. Not unfriendly, but not inclusive, the operational equivalent of neither encouraging nor discouraging. After the second briefing, 2 things shifted. One was that Vethnal began arriving in the chart room at roughly the same time as me and working at the adjacent terminal, which was either coincidence or wasn't. The other was that the junior analyst whose station was closest to the archive retrieval terminal, a quiet officer whose name the translator rendered as Vethorith, started placing the archive data logs in a position on the shared workspace where I could reach them, rather than in the elevated stack where they had previously been stored. This was, by any measure, a small thing. It was not a gesture of welcome, exactly. It was a practical adjustment, the kind of thing that happens when someone has recategorized an element in their operational environment from inert to useful. I appreciated it. I also did not mention it to anyone. It seemed like the right kind of thing to let happen without drawing attention to it. The third briefing was about the outer corridor mapping, the western approach to the Lethais system proper, which was where the operation was ultimately headed and where the bulk of the survey's diplomatic value lay, because the western approach was contested. Not militarily, not at the moment. Contested in the way that resource-adjacent space tends to be contested when two species with different survey methodologies have produced different maps of the same region, and neither map is authoritative, and the joint survey's purpose was to produce an authoritative one. The Threnval analysis of the Western approach was detailed and well supported. Their resonance mapping of the approach corridor's primary structure was among the best I had seen. What they did not have, because they had not needed it before this survey, was a working model of the Western approach's tidal interaction dynamics. The way the approach corridor's geometry, combined with the gravitational influence of the three large bodies at the Lethe system's edge, produced a set of periodic current patterns in the corridor's spatial medium that affected transit timing in ways that weren't obvious from a static survey, but that became operationally significant over a multi-week survey operation. The tidal interaction dynamics were not in the Threnval briefing materials. This was not a gap born of carelessness. It was a gap born of the fact that Threnval survey doctrine is built around their resonance mapping strength, and tidal interaction modeling is the kind of secondary analysis that tends to fall to the species in a joint operation that does it better. In a purely Threnval operation, they would have addressed it differently. In a joint operation, the assumption was that the human contingent would bring it. The human contingent was me, and I had in fact brought it. It was on pages 401 through 462 of my 462 pages, which I had by this point been carrying on my data tablet for 18 days, and which I had updated with corridor-specific data 3 times during the transit. I waited until the tidal analysis was listed in the briefing agenda as an item with a blank source notation, which meant no one had been assigned to provide it. And then I noted, in the format that Veth Sauron had used for her own data contributions, that I had a tidal interaction model for the Western approach covering the full survey duration, which I could provide for operational integration at whatever point was useful. Veth Sauron looked at me, then she looked at the operational record, then she looked at me again. "You have this prepared," she said. It was phrased as a statement, not quite as a question. "Yes," I said. "Since when?" "The preliminary model was built before my departure from the Meridian," I said. "I've updated it 3 times with corridor-specific data since we entered the survey zone. The current version accounts for the debris field interaction effects from the mid-sector." A pause. The briefing room was quiet. "The mid-sector interaction effects," Veth Sauron said, "were not in the original survey parameters." "No," I said, "but they're in the corridor, so I put them in the model." She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me to transfer the model to the operational display, which I did, and she spent the next 40 minutes working through it with the same methodical focus she had brought to the calibration analysis. She asked 6 questions. I answered all 6. On the 4th question, Veth Naron, who had been attending to the display with the steady, comprehensive focus she brought to operational data, asked a follow-up to my answer. It was a good follow-up. I answered it. She made a notation in the operational record. Veth Orvan asked a question on the 7th pass through the tidal model. It was a technical question, specific, asked in the same uninflected professional register he brought to everything. I answered it. He looked at the display for a moment after my answer. Then he made a notation of his own. I did not track any of this in my notes as a social event. It wasn't. It was operational. But I will say that the way the room attended to things for the rest of that briefing had a texture to it that was different from the first briefing, and from the second, and I thought about the informal observer notes and the line about not letting them define the numbers first, and I thought that the advice was correct, and that it had been worth following. On day 17, I was moved out of the auxiliary inventory column in the crew manifest. The corrected entry listed me under Operational Specialist, Joint Survey, Gravitational Analysis. I did not comment on this. I noted it, because the notation seemed relevant to the operational record, and then I went back to the tidal model update I was working on for the upcoming entry into the Western Approach Zone. The analyst who informed me of the manifest change was a junior officer named Veth, who was the same aide who had handed me my arrival documentation on the day I boarded the Lethizvan without looking at me. He told me about the manifest update in a direct, professional way that suggested he had been given the task of informing me and was carrying it out accurately. Then he paused at the door of my quarters. I had been given different quarters on day 15, on a different corridor, at a height where the bunk was reachable without a stepladder, a fact that had not been mentioned in any communication but that I had noted, and he asked me a question. He asked me how I had known where to look for the carbonaceous fraction analysis from the Meridian Geological Survey. He said it as though he had been thinking about it for a while, which he probably had. I told him that I had pulled every secondary archive that had been filed under the Lethise Corridor designation in the Meridian Records System, which was a standard cross-reference procedure for pre-mission preparation, and that the Geological Survey had been in the third batch of secondary files, and that the carbonaceous fraction data had been in a supplementary appendix at the back of the survey report that was not indexed in the main body of the document and would not have appeared in a keyword search. He attended to me for a moment. "You read the appendix," he said. "I read all the appendices," I said. He was quiet for another moment. Then he made a very small adjustment to the orientation of his outer surface. Not a bow, nothing as formal as that, but something in the direction of an acknowledgement, and he left. I went back to my tidal model. The entry into the Western Approach Zone happened on day 23, at 0600, and it went well in the way that operations go well when the preparation has been done carefully. The tidal interaction data I had built into the survey model proved accurate in its first operational application. The entry timing I had calculated to minimize corridor current interference matched the observed conditions within the margin I had projected, and Veth logged it with the specific annotation that human methodology tidal modeling had been operationally validated for Lethise corridor survey use. That annotation went into the permanent operational record. I did not read that annotation until 2 days later, when I was going through the record logs as part of my liaison documentation. I made a note of it and filed it with the rest. The Western Approach Zone survey ran for 11 days. On the third day, the lead resonance analyst, not Veth, who was running the primary data processing, but one of her junior analysts, a careful and precise officer named Veth, discovered a mapping discrepancy between the Threnval survey results and the existing human-side navigational charts for the approach zone's inner boundary. I should note about Veth that he had been one of the 2 junior analysts in the first briefing who had attended to me with the ambient disinterest that most of the room had brought to my presence that day. By day 25, he was asking me questions. Not frequently, and not on topics he would have been comfortable raising in a formal briefing setting. He was junior enough that the command hierarchy mattered to him in a way it didn't to Veth, who had the confidence of her technical rank. But in the chart room in the evenings, he had taken to working alongside me with a frequency that I did not think was accidental. He was good with data. He was also young for a Threnval, which I was still calibrating against, but young in the way that someone is young when they are very skilled and just beginning to understand what the limits of their training are. He asked me once in the evenings how I had decided to specialize in gravitational survey methodology rather than one of the primary disciplines. I told him that I had originally trained in navigational cartography, and that gravitational survey methodology had been a secondary specialization. I had added, because the 2 disciplines produced complementary blind spots, things that each one tended not to see that the other one caught, and that working across both meant I spent a lot of time in exactly the gap where each discipline's standard approach missed something. He was quiet for a while. Then he asked me what other secondary specializations I had. I told him. It took a few minutes. He attended to me with the same methodical focus he brought to data sets. That is, he said carefully, a large number of secondary specializations for one officer. I've been in the field for 14 years, I said. There's a lot of time in transit. He thought about that. Then he went back to his data, but with the slightly adjusted orientation that I had, over 3.5 weeks, learned to read as someone filing a thing away to think about later. The discrepancy was not large, but the inner boundary was operationally significant. It defined the edge of the formally contested region, and the location of the boundary determined which of the two species survey data would carry authority over a section of the approach that contained, among other things, a transit junction that 3 separate supply routes ran through. This is the kind of discrepancy that, in a joint operation, can become a diplomatic event if it is handled in the wrong sequence. It is also the kind of discrepancy that, in my experience, is usually the result of one or both surveys having a systematic error, and the correct way to handle it is to find the error before the diplomatic machinery gets involved. Vethnaron called a meeting on the morning of day 26. It was a small meeting, herself, Vethorvan, Vethsauron, and me. No aides, no junior analysts. The room was the small operational conference space adjacent to the survey data center, and for the first time in the operation I was offered a standing position at the data platform rather than a separate chair. I stood at the platform. It was a slightly awkward height for me, but I had been managing awkward heights for 3.5 weeks, and I had gotten good at it. Vethnaron presented the discrepancy without editorializing. She had a commander's economy with words, or their equivalent. She used exactly the resonance modulations needed to carry the information and no more. The discrepancy was 0.006 degrees of arcseconds in the inner boundary location, which translated to a physical distance of approximately 40 kilometers at the relevant coordinate. The Threnval survey showed the boundary 40 kilometers further toward the Lethai system center than the human navigational charts. Vethsauron had run the resonance data 3 times. She was confident in her readings. The human side charts, Vethorvan said, in the direction of neither Vethnaron nor the display but the specific zone of the operational data that held the navigational chart reference, use a different positional calibration standard. They use the Interstellar Cartographic Commission standard, I said, same as the Threnval survey protocol. A brief pause. The ICC standard allows for a margin of variance, he said. 0.003 arcseconds, I said. The discrepancy is double that. He was quiet. The human side charts for this section, I said, were compiled from 3 independent surveys conducted over a 16-year period. The oldest is from 41 years ago. The positional calibration on the oldest survey was performed with a navigational reference anchor that was later recalibrated after a platform drift event. I had pulled the chart provenance from the Meridian Navigation Archive during the first week of the operation, after I had seen the western approach boundary listed in the survey parameters, and noted that the human side charts for this section were not as current as the Threnval data. The drift-corrected coordinates shift the oldest survey's inner boundary reading by approximately 0.004 arcseconds toward the Lethai system center, which, when averaged with the 2 more recent surveys, produces a composite position that matches the Threnval survey reading to within the ICC margin of variance. The room was quiet for a moment. "You have the drift-corrected coordinates," Vethsauron said. It was the same tone as before, not quite a question. "Yes," I said. "When did you pull the chart provenance?" "Week 1, I said. It's standard practice to verify the vintage of navigational reference data before using it in a joint survey context." Another quiet moment. Vethnaron made a notation in the operational record. When she spoke, Her resonance modulation had the particular overtone that my 3 weeks aboard had taught me to associate with a finding being formally closed. "The inner boundary discrepancy is resolved," she said. "The navigational reference drift is logged. The Threnval survey reading will be designated as the operationally authoritative position." She attended to me for a moment in that comprehensive, forward-surface way of hers. "Liaison Officer Solis," she said, "is there other navigational reference data for the Western approach that requires provenance verification?" "I've been through the full chart set," I said. "The inner boundary was the only vintage issue. Everything else is within certification parameters." "You verified the full chart set?" "Week 2, I said. She was quiet. Around the table, around the platform, the 3 Threnval officers were attending to the display, or to the operational record, or to the middle distance. The ship's harmonic was the same low note it had always been. "Is there anything," Vethnaron said, "that you brought to this operation that you have not yet used?" I thought about it honestly. The third tidal model update has a predictive section for the outer approach zone that we haven't entered yet, I said. And I have a structural analysis of the transit junction based on the last 40 years of traffic logs, which may be useful when the Joint Operational Use Agreement is drafted. She attended to me. "I pulled the traffic logs in week 3, I said. "They weren't indexed to the survey files. I found them in the ICC Commercial Transit Archive." A very long pause. The outer surface of Vethnaron's form moved in its slow current. "Liaison Officer Solis," she said, "what was your understanding of your role in this operation?" I had been asked this before in different contexts, and I had a considered answer for it. "My role was described to me as observational and diplomatic," I said, "but the operation needed someone to do the secondary analysis work, so I did it." "Before the operation began." "The preparation is part of the work," I said. "I wasn't going to show up without it." Another pause. This one was different from the operational pauses that had preceded it. Vethorvan was attending to the display. Vethsaron was attending to me. Vethnaron was very still, not the continuous current stillness of her usual composure, but a specific, deliberate stillness that felt like something being reconsidered at a fundamental level. She made a notation in the operational record. I heard the formal log entry frequency. Then she looked at me again. "The operational file will be amended," she said, "to reclassify your contribution status from liaison observational to joint specialist. The amendment will be retroactive to the date of your boarding." "That's appreciated, Fleet Commander." "The auxiliary inventory placeholder will be removed entirely." I had forgotten it was there, I said. This was almost true. I had not forgotten it exactly, but I had decided some time ago that it was not worth attending to, and that had worked out to approximately the same thing. The survey completed on day 31. The Western approach data was clean, the inner boundary was resolved, the tidal model had held, and the joint operational record was 54 pages longer than the standard format because I had apparently contributed more documented findings than the standard format had columns for, and Vethsaron had needed to add a supplementary appendix. I did not comment on the appendix. I had a professional fondness for appendices. I had also, if I am being honest, spent a moment reading the appendix heading, which listed my contributions by category and cross-referenced each one to the original archive source I had pulled it from, and I thought that it was a thorough and accurate piece of documentation, and that Vethsaron had done a good job with it. I did not tell her this. She would have found it unnecessary, and she would have been right. On day 30, the afternoon before the survey concluded, I had a brief conversation with Vethorvan in the corridor outside the data center, the same corridor where we had passed each other in the first week, him going in and me pressing against the wall. This time he stopped. He told me that the operational record amendment, The reclassification from liaison observational to joint specialist had been processed, and that it would appear in the formal survey record transmitted to the ICC and to both species' respective command authorities. I thanked him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The preliminary operational assessment of your role in this survey estimated a 94% probability that your contribution would be limited to diplomatic facilitation and observational documentation." "That's a reasonable estimate from the available input data," I said. "The estimate was incorrect." "It was," I said, "but the input data was also incomplete." He attended to me. His outer surface moved in a slow, contained pattern that I had not seen before from him, or possibly had seen and not correctly parsed, because he had not previously directed it at me. "The input data," he said, "was your physical profile." "Yes," I said. "Physical profile specifications do not include secondary specialization inventories, cross-discipline archive methodology, or prior survey preparation depth." "They don't," I said. He was quiet for another moment. The corridor was empty except for the two of us and the low mechanical hum of the ship. "The manifest classification," he said, "was a data error." "It was a categorization error," I said. "The manifest was looking for a category and I wasn't in the expected column." He attended to me for one more moment. Then he made a formal acknowledgement tone, brief, professional, and continued down the corridor, and I turned and went back to work, and neither of us said anything else about it. On the last morning, before the Lethaisvans transit back to the junction point where I would transfer to my return shuttle, Vethnaron met me in the primary reception chamber. The same room, the same polished floor. She attended to me for a moment. Then she said that a formal commendation would be entered into the joint survey record and transmitted to Admiral Chen at the Meridian Station, noting my contributions to the operation. I thanked her. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "In the initial manifest classification." "The auxiliary inventory column," I said. "Yes," the pause. "The classification was based on your physical profile specifications. The column was the closest available designation to small, dense object of limited primary utility." "I know," I said. "The designation was incorrect." "It was," I said. "But to be fair to your manifest system, most objects in the auxiliary inventory column don't read all the appendices before they arrive." The outer surface of Vethnaron's form moved in a pattern I had not seen before. It was slow and contained, and it took me a moment, long enough that we were nearly at the end of the pause, to identify it as the Threnval equivalent of something in the general vicinity of a quiet laugh. Not a large one, not a performed one. A small, genuine, slightly reluctant one. "No," she said. "They generally do not." She attended to me for one more moment. Then she made a formal departure notation in the operational record and flowed, technically, but walked is close enough toward the bridge, and I picked up my kit and headed for the transfer bay. I did not gloat. There was nothing to gloat about. The survey had produced good data. The boundary question was resolved. The operation had gone well. I was also, for the record, filed correctly in the manifest. Small, dense, and fully present. That, in the end, was quite enough. The shuttle was on time. I slept most of the way back.